I know he's going to go after him, but why?
Yeah.
And that's the moment also where I realized that this entire film is built on emotional stakes.
This is A Lost Plot, the podcast where we explore meaning in movies together. Welcome back to another episode of A Lost Plot. I am your host, Maverick, and today we have a special guest, Chad Garrett. Now, Chad Garrett, he's a screenwriter and story consultant. He's also director and actor, and he story consulted and led in Parallel the Triad, and his first film included the music of Eric Zahn. Chad, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me here. This is great.
Absolutely. Now, today, we are discussing a little bit of an older movie. You could say, a decade or two older, but it's still got some give in it. It's called The Kingdom of Heaven, a 2005 epic historical drama. It is written by William Monahan, directed by Ridley Scott, and starring Orlando Bloom as Balian of Ibelin. I always forget how to say
Balian de Ibelin. Yeah.
Balian de Ibelin. And Eva Green as Sibylla of Jerusalem. Martin Koskas as Guy de Lusignan. I am so bad with these names sometimes.
Guy de Lusignan.
All right.
It's all French. It's all French to me.
Exactly. And Liam Neeson come back in as Godfrey de Ibelin. So we got a starstruck cast here. But more importantly, we want to know, Chad, what is the Kingdom of Heaven about?
The Kingdom of Heaven follows the character of Balian de Ibelin first through a very well-structured 3-act plot that first starts with him discovering who his father is and trying to find his place as a son who had never known his father, and then trying to discover his place in a new land because he goes from France to the Middle East, to the land of Canaan, Jerusalem, and finding himself embroiled in a political scheme between the Christians mainly and the Muslims that are out there, and led by the king, who's played by Edward Norton. I forget exactly which king it is. But he gives an also phenomenal performance from somebody that you never see his face because he's always wearing a mask. And then culminates with the death of that king, which is a historical fact. And Balian de Ibelin is left to defend Jerusalem. He is known historically as the defender of Jerusalem. And this is the story of how and why he surrendered Jerusalem to Saladin back in during the time of the First Crusade, after the Christians from France had owned the land of Jerusalem and what is now modern day Israel, and some more besides, for about 100 years.
Nice. That's a pretty good, quick way to put it. So out of the 9-point rating system, which we use on this podcast to rate and review these movies, what was your rating, Mr. Chad, sir? So
I have to caveat this, right? One of the reasons why we're talking about this is because this is my favorite movie of all time. That being said, it is not a perfect movie. Not in the slightest. So if we want to talk about perfect movies, that's a different podcast, right? You're throwing up Citizen Kane, Casablanca in there, and we can have that discussion on a different day. But my rating for The Kingdom of Heaven is very close to getting a perfect score. Whenever I went through the 9-point rating system that you guys have, ended up at like an 8.55.
Nice.
I think that I would get it a little bit closer if I could go back and change some of the things once I looked at the review and saw sort of the way that what it was that you were really asking. Yeah, and how it was broken down. I think that it would have gotten closer to like an 8.75. But at the same time, like I'm very, very biased. This film, I grew up with this movie. This is the first bloody movie that I was really allowed to watch from my parents. So I have a very soft spot for this film and for the themes and for the motifs. And we'll get into this, but it was very formative. The undergirding themes and the mood and what Balian goes through and the things that he has to overcome To this day,
Mm-hmm.
they move me to
Mm-hmm.
tears because they were so formative in who I've become as a person, or at least I believe so. So,
Yeah, and this movie is definitely very strong on the themes. And I will say, me and Chad just realized this before we started recording, is that there are two different versions of this film. One is the theatrical release, and one is the extended cut. Now, as you all know, I'm a big fan of the extended versions of things. You see my Lord of the Rings reviews, and you see that I like to spend 4.5 hours watching a movie. So,
just 4.5. Wait, hold on. Pause right there. You do them one at a time? Like, hold on. This is a 12-hour marathon.
yeah, exactly.
Any person in their right mind just sits and binges through, right? Like you're the abnormal one here, right?
Oh no. Well, what is New Year's for? Yeah, no. So I missed the the extended cut, and I watched the theatrical, and so that there's going to be some discrepancy, I'm sure, based on that.
Mhm.
But we will get into that today. Regardless, my review left this at a 6.10. So
Wow.
very different from what Chad got, and we shall discuss why, and hopefully we'll see if I can convince him that it should be lower, or he can convince me that it should be way, way higher. So let's get into it.
Accepted.
The opener. We love to talk about openers because that's what gets people to see if they even want to keep watching this movie. If I walk into your your living room and see you watching this, are the first 5 minutes going to pull me in? Did the opener catch your attention? Does it make you want to keep watching? What do you think on this?
2 words: Michael Sheen. Enough said. I'm in. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't actually recognize that it was Michael Sheen, who is really the star of the first, I would say, 2.5 minutes of the movie. He plays. You don't know this. This is one of those plot things that we're talking about.
I do not know this.
This is a very different thing. So the priest at the very beginning, right, that you've encountered, right, is played by Michael Sheen, right? Very well known vaudeville actor, just top of the line. In the theatrical cut, he's just a priest that's mentoring Balian.
Yep.
What you don't find out unless you watch the director's cut is that he is Balian's brother.
Yeah.
He is Balian's half brother. So everything that is happening in the opening, I would say almost 15 minutes, is driven by actually this really intricate family drama. So Balian's half brother is this priest, and that is one of the number one hooks that happens here, right? Is because you're wondering who it is that they're talking about, because the very opening of this film is the priest and these 2 gravediggers burying a body. And Michael Sheen's character not only steals a silver necklace off of her body, but orders her to be beheaded because she was supposedly a suicide.
Right.
And so you have the Ridley Scott quintessential sort of in the Gladiator. He had kind of this sepia tone over everything, very antiqued and yellow. In this film, it's very blue. It is very blue. It's cold. It's dingy. There's really high contrast. The blacks are really black and the whites are more gray. And this is reflective of the mood of what you're supposed to have, right? That, at least in this opening section, that France itself is almost this dying land, and the only place of hope and opportunity is in Jerusalem, is in the Holy Land. So that immediately catches me. The beheading of a body and not giving it proper burial rites, the grabbing of the necklace, and Michael Sheen's incredible performance, and just he does such a good job of being weird, even in the theatrical version. He does such a good job of just there's something really dingy about this guy, and you want to figure out what.
Exactly. Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that I didn't need as detailed as the color shading in the opening scene, and even for a theatrical release, I think the opener was pretty solid in that it was really quick, right to the point. It was in the theatrical version where they go, okay, he's here. Oh, his wife's dead. Oh, look, there's this shady priest, and he's stealing this necklace off of her, right? And all of these things. But it very quickly establishes where he's at, right? He's a guy who's in a lot of grief over what's going on in his life. And then he doesn't even know his father. And then his father shows up and says, hey, come with me to Israel. And he goes, no, I don't want to
No.
do this right now. Right. And that's like the baseline, the rejection of the call. And then it very quickly switches to him accepting the call when he gets in this deep rage, and then quickly goes from that deep rage after killing the priest to a deep-seated regret of what he's just done, and this desire to find redemption in the Holy Land. And so that's really what sets off the film.
It does set off the film, but you're also witnessing the culmination of another storyline. So Godfrey's story that you learn about, that you don't really get to experience up until this point, is finishing at this moment, because Godfrey is the brother to the current lord where Balian is living at. And Godfrey did not force himself onto Balian's mother, but it was a situation where she couldn't say no. And so Godfrey has lived and dealt with this regret for his entire life, right? 20 plus years, maybe 30 years. Back in that point in time, it probably would have been like 20 years if you want to like think about it realistically.
Right.
And so he has come from Jerusalem, where he is a lord and he has his own land and he doesn't have to compete with his brother and he doesn't have to do any of this, all the way back to France for one purpose, one reason and one reason alone, and that is to apologize to his son for not being there, for having abandoned him.
Right.
And there's this moment where Godfrey looks at him after Balian hears what he has to say, doesn't know how to think or feel, looks oddly angry to me, right? How dare you come back after all these years and expect me to just forgive you? And he says, if you want anything of me, ask of it now, for you will never see me again. And Balian looks at him and says, I want nothing. And so Godfrey gets on his horse and he rides away. That is the point for me that really set this film off. It was like, what? Like, I know he's going to go after him, but why?
Yeah.
And that's the moment also where I realized that this entire film is built on emotional stakes. Now,
yes,
you only get the context, by the way, that he is the uncle, or that he is the brother of the lord of the area, in the director's cut. Right? At first, you really think that he's just this lord that comes back, that he at one point, because he was a lord, forced himself on Balian's mom, and that was it. In the director's cut, you find out that he actually has claim to that plot of land. And there's actually the sheriff of that town is the nephew of Godfrey. And so at kind of the real and legit point of no return for the you might want to call it Act 1. You might want to call it the prologue almost for this film. When they're in the woods, the first fight scene that shows you that, this is going to be like, this is your introduction to what the combat in this movie is going to be like. It's going to be gory. It's going to be awesome. You're going to we're not going to pull any punches. This is the Gladiator turned to 11. During that fight, there's a point where the sheriff of the town, played by the same guy who played Jaime Lannister years later,
nice,
comes and he looks at Godfrey and he says, Balian has committed, your son has committed murder, right?
Okay,
give him to us.
Got it.
And so the moment, there's a line that Godfrey gives in both versions where he says, of those that fall here today, you will surely be among them. That line hits so much harder in the director's cut of this film when you know that he's saying it to his nephew.
That makes sense, because I was going to say there's nothing as much as that background is interesting. I don't know that necessarily is significant to telling the story, but I could see how that then plays into that initial scene where they have that fight, because absolutely, the familial relations, and you even see this later in the movie, but the familial relations is huge to the playing out of the story. And so who you're related to and what those connections are determines all of the power in Israel, and it even determines it beforehand in France.
It shows Godfrey, the truth of Godfrey, though. Here, this is why I think it wasn't, I disagree with the theatrical cut in the fact that they pulled it, is because it shows the necessity. It is a necessary scene because it shows the truth behind Godfrey to a deeper level. Here is a man that comes all the way back to France to apologize to his son for having not been there. And then whenever he gets snubbed, he's like, okay, I've done my bit, I'm going to leave. Right? We don't actually if it would have stayed there, we would have never known that that's that level of remorse. And we get the fact that he is a bit more remorseful when he's willing to fight for his son in the theatrical version. But when you realize that he is so remorseful over what he had done in his previous life, what he had done up until that point, and how sorry he was and how desperately he wanted to have a relationship with Balian, that he was willing to kill his own kin that he did know, that he probably acted in some way as an uncle or a father to some degree up to that point, that he is willing to fight that man and take that man's life for the sake of a son who he had not known up until that day.
Yeah.
That is true. Yeah. That is true repentance. Without that, deepens the level of repentance that Godfrey is pouring out, and the love that he's pouring out on this son that he never knew.
No, and I think Godfrey's arc is interesting, and you even see it to a certain degree in the theatrical cut. It is interesting to evaluate, especially because, you know, I've seen, for example, the Lord of the Rings extended cut so many times, it'd be hard for me to tell what was actually in the theatrical cut versus the extended edition. But in this case, I have no reference point for the extended cut, so it is interesting to see what creative choices, and to reflect myself on, was this actually a significant creative difference between the two stories? Yeah, I mean, Godfrey's arc, I respect, and especially even my own thought that was going through my head as you were talking about it is, when Godfrey asks for his repentance and the son rejects, or asks him to come back, and the son says he's not coming back, he immediately gets on his horse and leaves. And I think some people could take that as, oh, he doesn't really care that much because he didn't really try. And when I first saw that, I thought that was a sign of someone who was in serious distress, right? Because they were so penitent, they realized they didn't have an opportunity to get him to have this relationship. He was like, I'm not going to make myself sit in this pain that I've been agonizing over for years and years anymore. And so he's like, I've done my duty, and trying to emotionally escape by some way by physically moving away from him. I thought that was what reflected to me in the story.
Here's the other element of that, and why it is necessary for the plot, right? You want to talk about a lost plot and how easy it is to get lost in this, right? Yeah, I'll give you a shout out on this one. Is Godfrey's arc here is directly representative, especially in that moment where Balian rejects him, of Balian's arc over the rest of the movie. Godfrey comes to the holiest place in the world to him, even says that. Some people call Jerusalem the holiest place on earth, the center of forgiveness. Right. For me, it is right here, right now.
Right. That's
true.
And
he asks for forgiveness, and Balian doesn't give it to him. Balian snubs him, which is the exact same thing that Balian feels whenever he kills his brother, goes on this journey to Jerusalem, and then in Act 2, at the beginning of Act 2, he goes up onto the place to Golgotha, and he buries the necklace of his wife there, and he sits there. And that's another thing the director's cut does, is he actually gives Balian a lot of time on that hill that they cut out in the theatrical version.
Okay.
Ridley Scott in the director's cut gives that breath.
Yeah.
And it shows that he's there for for almost a full day, just sitting there. So that whenever he goes and he says, God does not speak to me, Balian feels snubbed now, right? Yeah. Balian has made this pilgrimage, hoping for forgiveness, begging for a way to atone for what he feels like is a sin to him, what everyone has told him is a sin to him. And he gets there and he hears nothing.
So let's talk about that. I mean, he's this main character. He starts off on this journey of repentance, and would you say this is really the part that starts him off, right? He has this feeling for a need to be redeemed from the acts he has just committed. Yep. Would you say that he is compellingly flawed, or has a compelling need to be involved throughout this story?
this is where my rating on my own film score kind of for this goes down a little bit. Is yes, his desire for redemption is a good starting point. And having loved a woman and feeling like his actions were the reason why she committed suicide, and needing repentance for that on his own behalf and on behalf of her, I think that that's a good reason to start on the journey. Ultimately, it's not until he lashes out in anger and loses his cool and kills his brother that he feels like, okay, not only do I have guilt over having potentially caused the death of my wife, right? Which the real reason she committed suicide is because his child was she had a failed pregnancy.
Yeah.
And so she got into postpartum and depression on top of the fact that she was morbid that her child died, which is very common back then. So take that or leave that. And so needing to find redemption for her because he's sad because he lost his wife, he's lost his child. He's now committed murder. The only place of salvation, the only place of rest that I think that he can find, right? It's just, it's a nightmare from the moment we meet Balian.
Yes, absolutely.
It becomes a further nightmare because what man finding out that your wife has been beheaded and your brother is after everything that you own, your small house, your little piece of land that you've got that your blacksmith sits on. He's after everything. He's trying to convince you to leave, and then you finally like, okay, look, I'm dead on the inside anyway. Now you're going to die. And then he decides it's like, okay, if in order to have some semblance of life, in order to find any element of redemption, I have to go.
Yeah.
I find that to be very compelling, but we don't understand the flaws of who Balian is until 45 minutes into the movie.
Yeah.
And that's where I start to lose it a little bit, right? Like, is he slightly, we never really see him lash out in anger again. He's very measured in everything that he does. So that first act that he has where he lashes out in anger at his brother, completely believable, but also never really resurfaces. Part of that is because all of the fights that he gets in are kind of justified after that. But you don't begin to understand his flaws in the battle of what his father told him, right? Because his father tells him, when he gives him the oath of being a knight, he says to be a good knight, right? Like that's the last, when Godfrey dies, the last thing that he tells Balian is basically go be a good knight. It's all you have to do. Protect the king. If the king is no more, protect the people. That's it. Right. And Balian's trying to figure out, while I search for my salvation, what does this mean? What does this command from my father mean?
I would agree. This was one of the parts that I gave it pretty middle of the road for. I thought that his beginning, like you said, amazing. Right. He has a really good opener. It starts off really, really strong. But I do think that once he has that discussion with his father, where the father knights him and tells him to be a good knight, and that is a guiding light for him moving forward, especially when that gets reaffirmed by King Baldwin, the Leper King. Right. And he goes, more or less, that to be a good knight and to follow your conscience is a noble thing to do. And he commends him for that. And that, from there on out, it's more of it's almost like his character, and this is, we'll discuss this a little bit more later, but it's almost like his character becomes, this is who I am, and it's simply testing the limits of that, right? Seeing how far is he willing to go to be this good knight that he has been called to in his original knighthood.
The end of Act 1, I think, is pinpointed by Balian leaving Jerusalem for Ibelin, for the fortress at Ibelin, to figure out what it is that he has inherited. Right. And from the moment that he leaves Jerusalem, Balian becomes kind of this non-plot character. He's a bystander waiting for something else to happen that is enticing for him to go. So until we have the moment at Carrick, where he intervenes and he protects, even at the potential of his own death or his imminent death, he decides to ride and protect the villagers so that they can get to safety from the invading Saracens. Until that moment, Balian is a sideline character while the politics of Jerusalem plays out between the Templars, the Kingsmen, and the Muslims.
Right.
And so his character arc begins to drag there. Now, his saving grace in that moment is he is immediately tested on the two things that both Hospitalier or Hospitaller. I don't know. I hate how that rolls off the tongue. So I call him Hospitalier. I'm pretty sure that that's the wrong pronunciation of that, but it sounds better to me than Hospitaller. Just because
is he a walking hospital? Like, what is he?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that. I don't know. It's weird. David Thewlis's character has one monologue, and King Baldwin has another monologue. Right. If you want two of the greatest monologues in cinema history that have real things that we can learn from today, it comes from these two. The first one says, "I put no stock in religion." Just Google that. And listen to David Thewlis give his monologue about "I put no stock in religion." From that moment where he says, you will be a good man here, here, right? What you do every day, what makes you good, is here and here, and what you decide to do, the actions that those two things entice you to do. And your ability to overcome the worst parts of those, right? You will be a good man or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so between that monologue and him putting the onus onto the self-agency onto Balian to be the man that his father has asked him to be, and to be the man that God has asked him to be, in that moment, paired with the monologue that we get from King Baldwin, where King Baldwin says the whole world is in chess. Right?
Yeah.
God might move a man, a king might move a man, and a man might move himself, and only then has his game truly begun.
Right.
But however you might be played, or by whom, your soul is your own. Right? Like that is a really, and immediately, even though he becomes a sideline character while the politics of Jerusalem plays out, he's immediately tested in this. Because Eva Green, Sibylla, comes to Evelyn, which is not where she's supposed to be, and they have an affair. And she's married to the main antagonist.
Right. Yeah.
So while the politics are playing out in Jerusalem, you've got Balian and Sibylla getting it on over here, and you want to root for them. And yet it is so easy to see the manipulation of Sibylla over Balian in this moment, and Balian is falling for it. Yeah.
And she's pretty open about it too. Like, she's literally saying, my husband almost, assumes that I'm having affairs, more or less, is what she indicates early on when she's first bringing him to the king. And it's like, okay, I mean, I will say, in some ways I respected Sibylla's character development. In other ways I was like, I do not care for this character at all.
Well, I think that it's actually better in the director's cut, because she gives a line in the director's cut that she doesn't give in the theatrical version, where she looks at Balian and says, the commandments are not for people like us.
Interesting.
It is for them.
Yeah. Her highfalutin.
And so Balian in that moment knows that she believes herself as queen to be above all of the morality that he is trying to abide by, that his father believed in, even though this woman was partially raised by his father. So she knows better. He knows she knows better. Yeah. Yeah. And so what you see playing out here, my favorite description of the relationship that you see play out over the course of the entire movie between Balian and Sibylla, is the Batman and Catwoman, right? Here you have the seductive woman who thinks that she's outside the law, trying to corrupt the just and good virtuous man. And yet at the end of the day, at the spoiler warning, the man chooses virtue, and that is what actually wins over the woman. Now, this film takes a slightly different take on that overall, because of the stakes that are at hand and the sheer amount of people that are there. But Sibylla's character, besides being a part of the politics of Jerusalem, is there to specifically test his virtue and his willingness and ability to grow beyond being the confused boy who inherited his dad's kingdom, who doesn't know how to choose right and wrong, and is thinking that being together with this beautiful queen is the top of the world, right? And he's even a little bit embattled by that. But can he grow beyond that when she is offered to him? She is offered to him to marry. He would be king regent.
Yeah, and we will get to that in a bit, but that is an excellent point. I do think the point on the Batman versus Catwoman thing is interesting. I don't know. I don't know if I think that it plays out. And granted, I'm looking at the theatrical cut, so I don't know that I get the same maybe grandiose interpretation of Sibylla as a character. But I do appreciate that analysis. What do you think about the other side characters? Did you think they were compellingly motivated in their own ways?
Jeremy Irons' character is one of the most interesting, I think. Saladin is incredible, and Guy Delusion is as good a bad guy as you can ask for. Right? Nice. Like, ultimately, like, Saladin is the bad guy that you want to root for. Guy is the bad guy that you understand everything that he's doing, why he's doing it. It's totally believable, and you hate him for it through and through. And it's a perfect foil. He really is a perfect foil to Balian. And I'll jump ahead for a second here, because there's a scene at the end of the movie after Jerusalem has been surrendered, because Guy doesn't die, right, even after Saladin takes him captive, where Guy is released back into the city after the fall, after Jerusalem falls, after Balian gives him up, and Balian is washing his face, and Guy comes up to him with a sword, and he's like, I'm going to duel you, basically. And so they have a duel, and it's a great choreographed duel. It's got 2 sword combat, it's got knives, it's got everything. And it is also a play on something that Guy had said earlier in Act 1, where Guy looks at Godfrey while Godfrey is dying and says, "Would I have fought you whenever you were a younger man?" Right? And so late in the film, he fights Balian, and Balian is using the same fighting techniques that his father taught him. So he does get to fight Godfrey in a way by fighting Balian, and he gets wrecked. And Balian is ready to kill him. Balian has the sword. He has that high guard, the guard of the hawk, that Godfrey teaches him in Act 1. And he is quivering. He wants to bring the sword down on Guy. And Guy is on his knees and asks Balian to do it. Balian puts the sword away, and he says, "When you rise, if you should rise a knight." Which is one of the most powerful things in this entire thing, because here you have this perfect foil of these. You have this perfect foil of these 2 characters, one that acts with virtue and one that thinks he's acting with virtue only to gain more power, right? Who uses religion, a man who believes he has religion, but is using it to get his own, to gain everything that he wants, regardless of morality. And a man who is acting morally, but thinks that he has lost the will of God. He thinks that he has lost the presence and the grace of God in his life. They are identical foils of each other. They're 2 sides of that coin. And yet you have the one who has lost his ability, or who thinks that he's lost the grace of God, who has been acting like a knight, who has been a knight, even though for all of the societal standards has no claim to be a knight. And the one who was born a knight, has claim to be a knight, continues to use that, uses his status and his privilege and all of these other things to try, and his religion, to try and gain all of this power, who is the least knightly person in the entire film. Well, so Bailey, the killing blow is a character blow, not a physical fighting blow. And that's great writing, because there was no more coming back. We don't need to see Guy anymore after that, ever.
Especially because it's dealing with the themes here, right? The idea of what it means to be a knight and all of these things. They're very strong in the story, especially because you have very different ideas represented in here. When he's coming into Jerusalem and you see the guy who is the not a monk, but a proselytizing monk, more or less, who's along the road as he's coming into Jerusalem, and he says, "It is the will of God to kill Arabs," and that is
So that's
claim,
Act 1. That's
right?
that's before Godfrey dies. That's not. They're not going into Jerusalem. They're in Italy at that point, getting ready to board the boat to go to Jerusalem. But yeah, he's like, for every infidel, killing an infidel is or killing a Muslim is not sin, but it is the pathway to heaven. The Pope has said it, right?
It's like these are the ideas that start to get introduced, where you have, for example, the Templars, who very much hold to that idea, and they live their life to create this genocide of these people because it is the will of God. And then you have these other people, like you said, why can't I think of the Hospitaller, where he's going, the mind and the heart is what you use in your own action. Do not listen to these other people and what they're saying is right or wrong, because they're more or less weaponizing the idea of God to commit these terrible acts. And you need to act of your own accord and to choose to do the right thing and to move forward with those actions. Right.
And that's a major theme of this, right? That is one of my favorite themes of this entire thing is that it provides the perspective, because especially in modern times, with all of the wars in the Middle East at the turn of the century, the continued war in the Middle East until very recently, now with Israel and Hamas, it is a very poignant story for our generation to take this and say, look, these crusades back then are no different than the crusades we are waging now. The things that we were doing back then and the way that we were using God we were taking the Lord's name in vain, right?
Right.
We were wearing it upon you like a cloak in vanity. We were committing sin in the aims of gaining wealth and power, all of us, regardless of the side. And that's what Balian represents to all of us. Is you have you have Saladin and the Islamics, which are aiming for a holy war to try and reclaim something that was not theirs originally. You've got the Christians who had taken it from them, and both sides are using the will of God as justification to go and do the exact opposite of what both religions propose. And here you have a person who is representative of all of us, witnessing this happen around us, thrust into this world at the same time, having to pick a side, having to do something. You can't stay on the sidelines, and yet trying to figure out, how do I do it in a way that is moral and right and just?
Right. And that's exactly what you see. And I love you brought up the point about Saladin and all of his troops as well, because they come as the Templars come in with this idea that it is the will of God for us to kill all these people and to take this land. You see the Muslims coming with that same mindset. It is the will of God for us to take over this land and to, rule it in our own way. And so it is interesting that both sides are coming at it from very different angles, but they both, in their core, believe it is the will of God for us to do this. And so that is why what we are doing is right and just. And that's where you have this character stepping in, Balian, saying, I came here to hear what God truly had to say, and I heard nothing. And so he's trying to find, there's a sense in which he's trying to find God in the middle of this, and he believes that God has abandoned him. And he comes to find out that that's not the case. But it's a very poignant aspect of the movie to discover almost like whose side is God on, and what does it mean to follow God in the midst of a terrible, terrible war.
And the answer to that is answered by Balian himself. Whenever he says, I will burn every stone. I will raise every stone, building, and holy place that you hold dear, that you have been fighting for, before I yield this city. Whenever he goes and he meets Saladin after the big climactic moment in the siege, it's like, I will tear it all down before I let you have a scrap of it.
That's right.
And he's absolutely correct, because the side that Balian is on is not on the side of the holy places. He's not on the side of the land. He's not on the side of the wealth. He's not on the side of the power. Protect the king. If the king is no more, protect the people. Balian was on the side of the people. God was on the side of the people. even Saladin, who gave compassion and allowed the people to leave Jerusalem, was on the side of God in that moment, because I firmly believe that God is for anyone who is for his prized creation, which is people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The thing that God loves most, the thing that God has literally cast angels out of heaven for, is for people.
Interesting.
And that's a whole theological argument that we can get into if you wanted to on a different day. But that's where I draw that line. And I think that especially for people, for young people, for believing people, the being a knight in this film is synonymous to the struggle that many young men have today, right? Of what does it mean to be a man? That's what Balian is learning to be. It's like, how do I be a man in this sphere? Which is why I love it, because he's learning virtue, he's learning morality, he's learning perseverance in the face of adversity constantly. He's learning what self-sacrifice means. And all of these things are virtuous, and all of these things are in the will of God, especially whenever he applies those things not to protect the self, but to protect others.
Like we said at the beginning, the themes are very strong in this movie, and you see them very much, especially embodied in these characters.
And just they're not force-fed, though. Like, that's the amazing thing, is that at no point, like, and it's countervailing opinions, right? Whenever you have, it's like the scene at the dinner table in Jurassic Park, right? That you have the entire theme of that film is laid out in that one scene. As a kid, I didn't get it. Now when I watch it as an adult, I'm like, everybody shut up, my favorite scene. Because you've got Jeff Goldblum's character over here presenting the core thematic question of, you guys keep asking if you can do a thing without stopping to wonder, should you do it? Right? And you have the old man who's doing all that, I forget his name, Dr. Allen. Dr. Allen is Grant. Dr. Allen Grant. It's the other guy. Anyway, Hammond? Dr. Hammond, that's it. So, and then Dr. Hammond is over here like, you're not excited by this? You guys don't think that this is something that's great? You don't think that this is where we should be doing? Like, what do you, like, we're at the precipice of human achievement here. How can you not see it? How are you not excited? And so, because those 2 points are the question, they're in direct opposition to each other at the same time. It doesn't feel spoon-fed because the characters embody this. I feel like it's the exact same thing here. You have you have Saladin, who is representing the perspective of, in order to have peace, I must have war. And so, and Saladin, the other crazy thing is, he knew he was going to die if he did not do what he was set out to do. He was brought into power in the Muslim Caliphate in Damascus to make sure that he could wage holy war and get Jerusalem back. He promised to get Jerusalem back. Right.
And you hear
there's an entire scene about that. Yeah. And so he's like, in order to have peace, I must have war. That's a great point, right? Where it's like, he's stuck between a rock and a hard place. Guy could have peace and instead chooses war. So they are foils of each other. And then you have the personal foils of Balian and Guy. And so you have all of these things that are representative of each other. And they just happen to clash in one of the most beautiful places that in the world. So,
and I will say that some of these, like you were saying early on, you know, when you were watching it at Jurassic Park as a kid, you didn't really understand that opening, bit around the dinner table, and now you understand why it's such a significant scene. I think there is definitely a lot of those kinds of things in, especially these thematic movies, but in general, in great stories, is you have these amazing scenes, especially like later on in the story when you're like, oh my goodness, this person's fighting this person, that's Luke's father, all these other things.
Yeah, right.
But the reason that those scenes are so effective is because they've laid such good groundwork earlier on with the introduction of these ideas and concepts of, okay, is this even the right discussion we should be having? Should we even be creating these dinosaurs? What does it mean to be a good knight? What does it mean? Like all these other discussions, they happen early on, provide this framework for having this conflict, and then have this huge payoff at the end where you have the answers to those questions provided.
Yeah, man.
Just in regards to the villain, which I know you touched on yourself, I thought both of Saladin and of Guy de Richelieu, I forget his last name, but anyways, Guy, I'm not a French guy. So Guy is, it is interesting to just hear you talk about, especially the fight at the end. And I think that that's important because one of my marks against this story was that you don't really have much conflict between him and Balian in the theatrical cut. And that's significant because in the story, you have this ominous foreboding between the two, that Guy is constantly nagging at Balian and saying, oh, you're a nobody, you are the son of Godfrey, and, Godfrey's a nobody, and it's not going to matter when I become king, and all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, the only thing that Guy really does to provide some sort of issue to Balian is when he sends his own soldiers to kill him after he gets crowned king. Other than that, he's more of a generic force that pushes the story forward, and that's the tangential conflict that he provides for Balian because he causes the war with the armies of Saladin. But other than that, it's like, okay, like what are we doing here?
Yeah, and without Ava Green's character Sibylla interacting with Guy, you actually don't get the foil in the theatrical version with Balian, right? The big climactic moment that should have happened in the theatrical version between Guy and Balian is when Balian arrives after Balian is supposed to be dead, when Guy is getting ready to march the armies out of Jerusalem to face off against Saladin, and Balian comes to confront him and say, no, don't do this, bad idea. Like, that should have been the climactic moment for it. Now, I can understand why they didn't make that choice. I can also understand in the writing and in the original script that there was a different moment that was supposed to happen, which is in the director's cut. But the fact that they left that on the cutting room floor is appalling to me, because you do have the political conflict from across, but they never come in direct conflict together until that moment in the director's cut, except for when they are at the tent before they march. And there was nothing written for them there to shoot because they had that other scene. So in the world of movie making, right, they didn't need to shoot anything there.
Yeah.
Because they had it somewhere else. And then the executives are like, hey, we're going to cut this back a little bit. Like,
yeah. Well, and that's important because conflict is the basis of story, right? It's not that somebody has this ideal world. It's that they have an ideal world and something stops them from getting that. And so the idea is that conflict comes in different forms, right? Internal conflict, external conflict, whatnot. But as we stated earlier, his internal conflict of who he should be gets resolved close to the end of Act 1, where he decides he is going to, according to the Hospitaller and according to King Baldwin and according to his father, be the good knight, right? And once he has decided that, the internal conflict, there is tests to it, but it's firmly established. And so now he needs a counterweight to provide an external conflict. And the fact that you don't have a direct conflict to him in the story, in the theatrical cut, I think is a huge problem to making this story more compelling. And I think that affects heightening the tension between the audience and the viewers and the movie, and between really appreciating what's going on to Balian himself.
I completely agree with this, because in the theatrical cut, the only time where you see the conflict between Guy and Balian happen actually physically is under the tent, but ideologically they're not actually in the same room. You have this entire Act 2 buildup of who Guy is and what he's willing to do for power. And then when King Baldwin, after the events at Carrick, when he's on his deathbed, he asks Balian to take Sibylla's hand in marriage. And Balian's like, yeah, sure, like, let's go. And he's like, wait, hear it all before you answer. And so when they explain everything and they say what's going to happen to Guy and any of his knights that don't swear allegiance to King Baldwin, that's the point where Balian realizes that they are asking him to become the very thing that they are trying to defeat.
Yeah.
Only
he
became
the very thing you swore to destroy.
Right, yeah. Exactly. The type of man that would be willing to sacrifice tens, hundreds, maybe thousands of lives for what? A woman? The security of a kingdom that is now going to be built on what? Blood. Not peace like you've promised it. Blood. Necessary blood? Maybe. Sibylla makes a fantastic point when she says, one day you will come to realize that you wish you would have done a little evil for a greater good. She's correct. Even though she's been trying to manipulate him this whole time and make him believe that he is above the law, that he is in the same realm as she is, even though he has had to play by the commoner's rules his entire life. This is the first really good point she makes. And Balian makes an even better point where he says this is a kingdom of conscience or a kingdom of nothing.
I did love that line by the Sibylla. I was like, all right, I wasn't a huge fan of this character, but that was an awesome line.
Yeah, and that's one of those, man, like being a young man, having a queen being offered to you who like isn't just a queen, but she's also hot. Like,
yeah.
Like
why wouldn't you say yes?
any real honest man, especially a young man, especially grieving young man who had a wife before and who like knows how nice it is to have a nice woman in bed, who has also been having an affair with this very same woman that they're trying to be like, hey, we're going to make this legal. Like, you don't have to hide it anymore. You can just do it, right? Yeah, you can just be with this person.
Yeah.
Like if that's offered to you on a silver platter and you like, and the consequence is, oh, my worst enemy has to die. Like the guy who tried to have me killed has to die.
Exactly.
Like, oops.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Or the guy who wants me dead. He hasn't tried to kill me yet, but the guy wh wants me dead has to die. Oops. Yeah. Like that is, it's the silliest, choice that Balian makes, but it is only believable because you had the entire build up with Godfrey first, and then him making the mistake, however enjoyable, of being with Sibylla.
Right.
And so having gone through all of this, Balian's choice makes sense. It doesn't seem like it's fudged, or it doesn't seem like it's unbelievable. It doesn't pull us out, right? It doesn't pull us out of our suspension of disbelief. Because we've seen this progression, we've seen the mistakes, we understand how much his conscience bothers him in the face of feeling like God has abandoned him.
Right.
And so he's like, at this very moment, this is the quintessential place. This is where I have to say no. Because if I choose wrong here, everything else was practice. This is the Super Bowl. If I make a wrong play, it's over. It's Ned Stark lying, right? Ned Stark's character was dead long before they took his head. Anybody who understands storytelling knows the moment that Ned Stark abandoned his honor, which was everything his character was built on, he committed characterical suicide. He had to die. So it would have been the same thing. It would have been the same thing for Balian. The moment that Balian decides to go against what his father said, right, is a kingdom of conscience. It is a kingdom of heaven. The moment that he says it is a kingdom of conscience or it is a kingdom of nothing, like if he doesn't say that, he disgraces Godfrey. He has to die.
Cool. I'm going to jump a little bit down. We're going to look at Revelations because I think that's a significant question.
Before you do that, I think that's a great thing. Before you do that, I want to hammer home a point that I have like danced around a little bit here, because you were talking about enemies, and you're talking about antagonists and things like that in this. One of the things that makes this plot or this plot in this film so brilliantly written is that almost every character, to a degree, is an enemy to Balian, besides Godfrey and Hospitaller. Right?
You even think King Baldwin is an enemy?
Yes, Baldwin is the one that concocts the plan for him to kill Guy. Baldwin is the one that advises him the most. And it's Baldwin's own advice in the beginning that says a man has to move himself, right? The soul of the man, it says the soul of the man belongs to him. Balian quotes Baldwin back to himself, and that's what gets Baldwin to acquiesce and to let Balian walk out of the room. But Baldwin is the one that makes the offer to Balian to become Guy. And so at that moment, Baldwin becomes an enemy.
Yeah, I mean,
as does Tiberius.
Interesting. Yeah,
Tiberius and Baldwin become an enemy at that point. Saladin is an enemy at another point. The guy who is Saladin's friend, right?
Yeah. My
or
favorite, what's his face?
Saladin's
Yeah.
student, right?
Yeah, the chancellor of his armies. Yeah. What's
So
his name?
he is an enemy. Sibylla is a
Hmm.
corrupting influence over Balian, and so what you
Yeah.
have is they are enemies, but not in the strict sense of it. They
Right.
are
Right.
from if you've ever read John Truby's The Anatomy of Story, he talks about four
Hmm.
corner opposition. When you ask a thematic question and each character takes a position on that, right, as
Hmm.
to yes or no to the thematic question, and then a positive or negative outcome due
Hmm.
to their
Hmm.
stance on that question, and then you start to pit those characters against one another, it creates internal conflict
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
ideological conflict that you don't typically have. So what you've seen here is Balian has this desire to live a moral and just life and tries
Hmm.
to have a positive outcome for it,
Hmm.
right? So that will put him in the top quadrant.
Right.
And then
Right.
you have
Right. Right.
Sibylla, who is also trying to live a who doesn't think that you need to live a moral and just life and yet is having a positive outcome for it. Then you have Guy on the
Hmm.
bottom right, where Guy is not living a moral and just life and he's not really
Hmm.
having a positive outcome for it.
Right.
And then you've got Baldwin on the other side, who is trying to do everything that he can as king. He actually kind of falls in the same category as Sibylla. He's trying to do the moral and or no, in the same one as bottom left. So he's getting the positive. He's trying to get the positive outcome, but sometimes he
Right.
has
Right.
to do things that don't seem quite moral, which is the only reason why he offers to kill Guy in that
Hmm.
way. He knows it's not
Yeah.
moral. He knows he's asking Balian to do something that is immoral, that goes against Balian's mantra,
Hmm.
which is why he tells him, listen to the whole thing before you answer.
Hmm. Hmm. Right. Well, and you could tell. No, I get what you're saying, and I do think that's. I would say, I mean, this is just parting hair, so I don't want to like part on here. I wouldn't say that he's a villain as much as like he creates internal conflict in the form of this dilemma. But like,
You don't
it's
have to be a
I can see
villain.
where you
Yeah.
get to I see where you get
You
to the
don't
same
have to be
conclusion.
a villain
Yeah,
to be an
yeah.
antagonist, right? And the best stories have antagonists, have
Fair.
characters that are oftentimes on the same side that are antagonistic towards one another, right?
Yes.
Baldwin,
Yes.
Sibylla, and Balian are all on the same side, and yet there is conflict, ideological conflict between the
Yeah.
three of them without you
Yeah.
needing to have Baldwin. Or without you needing to have Guy. Guy is the direct foil, yes, but there are subtler conflicts that are happening between these characters all the way through, and that's sort of how you get that.
Yeah, no, and that's a good analysis. I would definitely say that it is important to note that they put that in every element of it, and they do that well. Was there a big revelation in this movie that made you go like, "Oh my goodness, this changes everything"?
Are you talking about like a story revelation? So something that like came out of left field that I had no idea was going to be coming. Man,
Yeah.
I've seen this movie so many times, nothing surprises me anymore.
Yeah. And this is. I should give a header for this section, which I haven't yet in the 9-point system. But the idea here is that beyond having a compelling story, the best ones are ones that give that extra twist, almost like that give you that like, oh my goodness, I wasn't expecting that. And so it's not like a necessity for having a compelling story, but it's like almost that extra oomph that adds that value. And so in the rating system, this isn't like worth a ton of points, but it is like an acknowledgement that some of the best stories have that surprise that you were not expecting.
So I want to rephrase it slightly. Are you talking about bridging the gaps, right? So you as a story writer, you build this expectation of what's going to happen next, and then you bridge the gap. What happens next isn't what you're expecting, but it's also logical. It's a logical thing. That's what. Yes. Okay. So Robert McKee calls that creating the gap, right? So you create the expectation, which also creates a gap, and then you bridge that gap and you jump that gap by having the characters do something that you're not expecting them to do. Biggest revelation is whenever Balian turns down Baldwin, because that's the pivotal moment where it's so easy. Everything that he has done has been in concert and in service to the king. And here the king is on his deathbed, and I'm going to contradict myself a little bit earlier, because at the same time that he is honoring his father's wishes and his father's will, he is becoming his own man and disobeying his father. Right? His father willed him and made him and told him, be a good knight. Right? His father also told him, protect the king.
Right.
Balian turning the king down does not protect the king. Even to a degree, it doesn't protect the people.
Yeah.
So he's contradicting Godfrey in that way, and Godfrey's wishes in that way, while honoring another side of it. So you've built up this expectation that Balian's going to be, he has the relationship with Sibylla. Sibylla loves him. He has the relationship with Baldwin. Baldwin loves him. He has the relationship with Tiberius. Tiberius loves him. Everything is building up. He has the opportunity to be the one thing that solves all the problems. And to a degree, we're rooting for him. Yes, go, do it, take it. It's right there. You've endured so much suck. Take the gift. And yet it is the right thing for him to bridge that gap. And we understand why he says no. Right? That moment where he says it is a kingdom of conscience or it is a kingdom of nothing, where he's talking to Tiberius in the hallway.
The one that stuck out to me was the revelation that Imad ad-Din al-Asfahani, the chancellor of Saladin's troops, was not just a servant, he was actually a strong leader in Saladin's army. And that was oh wow, I was not expecting that. It does make it so that he ends up surviving what would have been a brutal massacre for him and his army, right? And
your
so it is
will be known among your enemies before ever you meet them, my friend.
Exactly. And to be fair, like, that foreshadowing was very strong early on in the story. And so I don't know that the revelation was a game changer per se compared to some other revelations in movies, but it still got some points for me because of revelations like that.
So when Balian is getting ready to leave Jerusalem, Imad brings him the horse that they fought over at the very beginning. Yeah. And he says, this is not a very good horse. I don't think that I will keep it. And so Balian mounts that's a funny moment. Balian mounts the horse, and then he says, if God is not with you, how could you have done all the things that you have done? Coming from someone who was on the opposing side, who has had multiple opportunities now to get him massacred, and who has been his advocate in Saladin's camp because of one interaction on a desert beach. That revelation, right? And because that's not a revelation of any one specific person's action, that is a revelation by someone who Balian respects for something that Balian has been searching for the entirety of the film. Right. It answers the question that Balian has been asking from the very beginning of, where is God? Where is God in all of this? Where is God in my wife's death? Where is God in my brother's backstabbing? Where is God in my father's death? Where is God when I visit the place he was crucified? Where is God in all of these actions? Where is God in all of this war? Where is God in all of this bloodshed? And it's finally delivered to him. God is in you. God is acting through you, through the very things, because you're choosing to act and be virtuous in the way that the Bible tells us to, in the way that parts of the Quran tell us to. When you act with that virtue, you become the surrogate for God. If God is not with you, how could you do all of these things? That is a beautiful revelation that happens internally that we only get to see because it's externalized by this enemy, but also a friend to Balian.
Yeah, and I will say that especially that actually brings the full circle to the messages in the movie, because like you just said, it completes that arc that he's wondering this entire time and actually comes to the conclusion himself that he's been abandoned by God. And that really turns that on his head. And he goes, as a matter of fact, no, it is not possible for you to have defended Jerusalem like you have without having God on your side.
Right.
And so it is a great bookend to the message that it's trying to tell in the story. Is there any other messages you've seen in this movie that you felt were conveyed well?
The message with Sibylla, right? She was incredibly self-centered. She was incredibly embroiled in her own and her own selfishness. And you want to talk about a woman that is beaten down in this movie. I mean, so, and this is something that you don't get in the theatrical version.
If I had a quarter every time you said that.
In the theatrical version, she finds out that her son has leprosy, and then her son dies, right? Right. That's what you're kind of given and shown. In the director's cut, she kills her son. She hasn't seen her brother, Baldwin, for 15 years almost. 14 years, something like that. Ever since he had leprosy, she couldn't bear to look at him. And she goes to visit his grave after he dies and looks upon him for the first time. And she weeps. She sees him one more time before he dies, and then he dies in her arms, and then she removes the mask while in the crypt. And there is so much that is unsaid, but that is said through her acting, through Ava Green's acting in that moment. And then immediately on the heels of that revelation, she finds out that her own son has leprosy. So she's just reconciled with the fact that she hasn't seen her brother, that she has selfishly avoided the person that she has arguably loved the most in this world besides her own son, the one person that has advocated for her since he was a child king. And her son gets leprosy, and so her decision to kill him breaks her completely, because it is at her son's funeral that she gives Guy the keys to the kingdom, literally. And it's out of grief, and that's what drives her to tell Balian when Balian comes back, save us from what I have done.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So she's gone through all of this. She's higher than everyone. She's trying to seduce Balian into loving this queen. She's trying to be better. She agrees with Baldwin to try and get Balian to marry her so that Guy dies. And then, boom, her brother dies. And she hasn't seen him in years. Boom, her son gets leprosy. She's forced to either watch her son go through the same thing that she couldn't look at her brother for years, or kill him. And she kills him. And then that snaps her, and she, in her grief, she's like, I'm so distraught I can't even make a decision now. I just need someone to make a decision. The only person that can make a decision is Guy. Here, take it. Do what you will. Yeah. And so through all of that, she's watching the kingdom, her brother's kingdom, collapse around her. She asks Balian like why they couldn't be together, and he's like, and he tells her, he's like, choose not to be a queen and I will come to you. Right? Yeah. Because he has recognized that the power is what has been so corrupting. That there's something about this insanity around the politics, and insanity around the power, and insanity around the religion, and all of the things that come with that. And he says, I have learned enough to realize that the people of this place are the thing that are most valuable. It's something that you haven't. So choose to be one of the people. Choose to accept the commandments, right? Choose to live a moral and just life that your queenship has placed you, by your own admission, has placed you above. Choose not to be a queen, and I will come to you. Because now we're equally yoked.
Right.
So that's another revelation in a way. That's another thematic thing where making the choice to walk away from power, or at least making the choice to walk away from the corrupting influence power may have, is really the point of Sibylla, that even those that are in power have struggles, very deep and abiding struggles, that money and power and wealth and fame don't solve all of your problems. And sometimes you need to choose to be one of the people in order to appreciate all of the things that you have, and in order to live a just life, a right life with God. Queens don't walk, and yet you are walking.
And that's what you see at the end. And that's what you even see to a certain degree when she cuts her hair late at the end of the movie as she's preparing to help with the people in the middle of the fight for Jerusalem. So yeah, no, that's definitely a strong theme. The themes come full circle about God and the message about being God blessing the one who stands true no matter the darkness. That kind of theme is very strong. It's got a lot of very strong themes, and I think that's one of the reasons this movie is even in the theatrical cut, a 6 point whatever that I gave it is actually a pretty solid rating for me. I don't know if you've seen that in my reviews, but the themes are a reason for that. Is that the themes and the messages in this movie are very strong and they play out very well. And also, frankly, the dialogue is pretty dang good too, which I am a big personal stickler for dialogue, so I appreciated that. Doesn't affect the story as much, but
Right.
I just personal pet peeve.
Yeah, there are very few lines that I think there's only one line that I don't like the delivery on in the entire film.
After the hundreds of times I've watched this, I have one pet peeve.
Yeah, it's one. It's really it, and that's whenever Guy says, "Assemble the army," right after he kills the guy in the courtyard. It's like the one delivery of the line that I just something about it just doesn't sell for me.
Yeah, a little stereotypical bad guy line.
Yeah, it's like assemble the armor, and like how he does it, and it's just like, okay, you guys were rushed to that day. You were struggling to make your day. That's what I get off of that
one. Someone didn't have dinner yet, or something.
Yeah, somebody. Yeah, I don't know what it was. Yeah. That one didn't sell for me. What was your favorite piece of this of the entire film? If you had to pick one, whether it be a theme, whether it be a sequence of sets, if it's the character, what is your favorite thing for somebody that gave it a relatively, I guess, out of a 9-point scale, a 6.4? I think is what you said. You gave it a 6.5.
Yeah, it was a 6.1.
It was 6.1. Okay.
Yeah. So my favorite thing probably would be the themes, especially around the discussion of what God wants and what it means to be a good knight were really strong for me. I really also appreciated King Baldwin IV's character. I think that he's an excellent, excellent character. And it's not just because he has the mask on that makes him unique for a cinematic point of view, but more because he is a philosophical king who is trying to do the right thing in the midst of daggers, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what makes him a compelling character, is he's trying to do the right thing while understanding that he has to play this balance and trying to do that in the midst of even a personal struggle for survival, right? And there's some really powerful scenes with him where he goes from Saladin saying, "I'm going to punish the men who did wrong," and you go, okay, well, is he going to give him like a slap on the wrist? And you kind of get the impression he might, but Saladin believes him. And you go, okay, well, why would this great leader believe him? And he walks into the courtyard and he says, "Kiss the ring," and he takes off his glove. And you go, oh, man, that's nasty. And you're about to contract leprosy, dude.
Yeah, that's it. It was the kiss of peace. Man. It was the kiss of death. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's just like, okay, this guy just marked him as a dead man by making him kiss the ring. And that was the big deal. And so there was a couple scenes like that that took him above just being a king who wants to do the right thing to a unique character that really was compelling in his own way, that he tried to do justice, and justice looked very different in that case than the average king's actions. So I really appreciated him as a character.
So what's the thing that irks you? I guess we talked a little bit about the beginning and maybe some of how the character stuff doesn't seem particularly well motivated towards the middle. Yeah. What drives the score down so far for you to lose it almost 3 total points?
You're like, how could you?
No. I've been making a lot of points. You seem to have been agreeing with me. I'm very curious to hear how you sway me and tell me like I feel like I've made a very hard case as to why the movie's as good as I think it is. I haven't heard much of like what the case is against it yet. So I'm very curious. I want to know.
Yeah, so some of this, and this was clearly explained in our back and forth about, for example, the villain Guy, where the theatrical cut is frankly different from the extended cut, and so all I have to base it off of is the theatrical cut. So I can't speak to, for example, the extended edition of this film when I haven't seen it, and so I can't base my personal review on it. It lost a lot of points, frankly, from the villain standpoint. The revelations aspect. My more issue with that is I think a lot of your points are more based on thematic elements and ideas which are addressed in other parts of the review. So it did get solid points for that in that regard. But in regards to actual revelations, it got little to no points from me, which isn't surprising. Most films don't. And then and this does play into partially with the villains. And I kind of stepped over it a little bit for the sake of time, but we sort of danced around it in the discussion of the villains already. And that was the idea of heightening the tension for the audience, right? How are you so engaged that you're concerned about what's going to happen to the audience or to the main character? And I think the resolution of Balian's internal conflict fairly early on, as he's now solidified in regards to his beliefs, reduces the amount of heightened tension throughout the movie consistently. And this is something you see somewhat, because they started off really, really strong in regards to heightening the tension. He's like, oh, he's put in a worse situation. Oh, he's put in a worse situation. And then once you get into Jerusalem, I get more of an impression of a back and forth between, oh, things are bad, but then they reset to normal. Oh, they're bad, but then they're reset to normal until you get to the part where King Baldwin dies. And then at that point, it goes back into bad again. So it lost some points there for me because it's like the whole goal is to bring people on this roller coaster of emotions where they go, oh, they get getting drawn back in. It's kind of like with the fishing, where you kind of wrestle with the fish and let them have a little slack, then you pull them back, and you have a little slack, right? And a good example of this, which we just discussed on the podcast, was One Life, which just recently came out in the United States. It's all about the issue of what's his name? He was a refugee. He helped the refugees to escape from Czechoslovakia right before Hitler invaded it during World War II. And it jumps back and forth between the very real danger of that going on in his life and then a quote unquote current day aspect where he's an old man trying to now figure out what he's trying to do with his life with this backstory of what's gone on. Right. And so they provide a good tension between those two. And I think the big, almost like lag where you said he spends a good period of time in his home in Balian, I believe it was what it was called. And he's pretty detached from the rest of the conflict. And while there's other conflicts going on between the other characters, we're really caring about, most importantly, Balian, right? And it's a lot harder to be drawn into the conflict and to care what's going on when our main character isn't even involved in that. So that's where you see some of that.
And anytime that I've ever talked to anybody else about where the film drags a little bit for them, it's like when he goes to Ibelin, right? Because you're right. It does seem like it's here's this journey, here's this journey, here's this journey, and here's like a non-committal resolution to this thing that he's battling with. Like he's still battling with it, but he's obviously not going to get his answer. He's been counseled on it by several different people, and then he's been commanded by the king to like go take over his land and turn a patch of dirt into something that's lush and green and gorgeous. And it's fun to watch him do that. We enjoy watching him do that, but it's this. It could almost be two movies, almost, right? Like it wouldn't be satisfying as two movies, but it's this almost return to equilibrium as he tries to figure out what this new life bears for him. And that does, if you're not previously invested in his journey from Act 1, there's no way you're surviving the opening of Act 2.
What about, I think I know where your satisfaction lies, but did that last scene really leave you with that desire for more? What did you think overall?
No, so the last scene, at least in the director's cut, is Balian and Sibylla go back to France and they visit his wife's grave and his old home and things like that. And King Richard actually shows up to try and recruit him to go back and turns him down. And then he and Sibylla actually ride off into the sunset, kind of almost a Western style. They don't even stay at the place where Balian was. It's like they came back to visit and they're off to somewhere else. And it's like where that somewhere else is, like, I don't know. I don't particularly care. I have everything that I need from Balian to Evelyn. I hope that he has peace. I hope that he has found God and that he recognizes God within himself. And I pray that he used that as a testimony for he, his wife, his family, and for those that he encounters. But as far as needing more from that, I needed nothing. From the moment they could have ended it at the moment where Balian and I'm partially glad they didn't. Right, I'm partially glad that they gave him that moment back with his wife, and they gave him that final.
Not off.
Yeah, the final. The words are escaping me right now, but closure.
You're talking about when he looks at
closure
her, yeah.
with his wife, right?
Mm-hmm.
And closure with knowing that there's nothing else that he needs in the Holy Land, right? That and this is the gentleman that wrote this knew his theology, because there's actually a couple of scenes that allude to the idea that the writer understood the biblical principle that at the moment of Christ's death, or sorry, not at the moment of Christ's death, but at the moment of Pentecost in the Bible, that those that were touched by the tongues of fire and had the Holy Spirit imbued in them became tabernacles. So the reason why the Jews used to build the tabernacle is because the Holy of Holies resided within it. So the Holy Spirit, the Holy of Holies, was inside the inner sanctum of the tabernacle. And so they had to protect that, and that's where they made their sacrifices. When Christ ascended into heaven and then the tongues of flame came down on the days of Pentecost, we became tabernacles. The Holy of Holies imbued in us. We became the Holy Land, right? Jerusalem resides within us is the sort of idea biblically that comes out of this. Not that Jerusalem is not important, right? I'm a firm believer in the Old Testament. I believe that when Deuteronomy says that the only place that God's eyes are on at all times is on Jerusalem, I firmly believe that is true. At the same time, you don't specifically, as Christians, we don't believe that you specifically need a third temple as the Jews believe, because we are all, each of us, the body of Christ, the body of the believing word imbued with that Holy Spirit. And that this alludes to that. And so that ending moment for me as a Christian who understands my theology, and for those that maybe don't, but maybe are walking their way through it, the end of this film understands that whenever King Richard is going on this next crusade to reclaim the Holy Land, he's actually not following the Bible at all, because you don't need to. Right. You don't need to go and reclaim the Holy Land. The Holy Land is within you. The Holy Spirit is within you. If you're a believer of Christ, the idea is that you don't need to go and build another tabernacle. Yes, it's an important place historically where a lot of things happen, but you don't need to fulfill the will of God by claiming a piece of land. You need to fulfill the will of God by impacting the people that are around you, because you have been imbued. God dwells within you. And that's what you see happening throughout the entire film is God acting through Balian. And when Balian turns King Richard down, he's acknowledging that. In a very subtle way, he's acknowledging that. And then he and Sibylla go and they ride off into the sunset. So it's good. It's necessary to a degree because there's a lot of depth in that very short scene. At the same time, I think that the only reason I get that out of that is because I understand that part of theology.
Sure.
And to someone who is not as well versed in theology, it might not do anything for them. And I think that you could have ended the movie at the moment where Sibylla and Balian are walking out of Jerusalem and she holds his hand because she's walking instead of riding, right?
Right. Yeah.
When that happens, I think you could have ended it there and let the credits roll and you would have been fine.
Yeah. And from a purely... I love the theology bit. That's a very good wraparound. But even beyond that, for maybe a less theologically minded individual, I think it still holds some value. And just so that you see him return to the old life that he used to live. And the big question is then, what kind of person has he become now that he's back in his old world? And he has become a new man, where you see that he rejects the call again to go back to the Holy Land. And he understands that some of those themes that you just discussed, but just beyond that he doesn't need that's not where he belongs, and that his place is now back in France. Whether or not he's still in his hometown is definitely a question. Yeah,
It's ultimately
exactly.
but having the closure that he did come back, that he made peace with his old demons, that he has
Hmm.
found God within himself, that he has realized through his trials and tribulations that he has answered the thing, right? Like, God is
Hmm.
not with me. I've lost my religion. Is like, I put no stock in
Yeah,
religion, right? Like,
yeah.
you don't need religion. What you need is faith, right? The
Hmm.
faith that God is acting through you, and that you want to honor him, but through your day to day actions, honor God, honor the morality, honor the virtue by acting and
Hmm.
interacting with people that are the embodiment and the important part of all of this is people.
Yeah.
That's the quintessential question here: is what is it that God is after? Is he after a spit of land, or is he after the people that inhabit it? And the answer is the people, completely the people.
That's good. And honestly, I agreed with all of that last bit. I gave it full points at the end, so
Yeah,
that last bit didn't take anything from me, and that's probably a good place to end it. So,
yeah, man, we got to
Chad,
do this again, man. We've got
yeah.
all kinds to talk about. Like, we haven't even talked about Whiplash. Like, what's going on?
That's right. Well, where can people find you if they're trying to find you?
Oh, best way to find me. Best dialogue in a movie is Whiplash. Best way to find me. I am on X, formerly Twitter, at Storycraft
Mhm.
HQ. Um,
Nice.
also on YouTube, I do keep up a little bit. I host my old man's. If you liked the theology questions and the theology thing that we talked about, my father does a faith based podcast. It talks about tenacity and leadership, but also about testimonies. So by the blood of Christ and the words of your testimony shall you be saved. So he's over there at Forerunner Productions on YouTube. His show is called Let's Talk Fortitude, and finding fortitude in leadership, in entrepreneurship, in faith, in discipleship. He's had everybody from Navy SEALs that blew Noriega's boat to
Wow.
pastors that have done missions trips in Greece and beyond. He's had the whole gambit there on that podcast. Some of the old guys that have worked with Phil Roberts and the Duck Dynasty crew have been on his podcast. We actually
Okay. Yeah.
filmed in the what they call the lair, where they shoot the Unashamed podcast and have all of their hunting gear for all of their duck hunting. We've actually
Hmm.
got to shoot in there with Dane Burley Jennings, so that was a lot of fun. So
Nice.
that's over there. Also, as my short film gets through the festival circuit later this year, as it wraps up its festival circuit, it will be found either over there or at forerunnerproductions.locals.com. Forerunnerproductions.locals.com. That is where, if you want to support what we do, if you want to support myself and the stories that I'm telling, the stories that I'm writing, and other things like that, if you want to have a more intimate connection with me outside of the face that we have to have on social medias and things of that nature, you can do that at forerunnerproductions.locals.com. That's a great platform. That's our monetization platform. That's where we try and pay the bills.
Well, cool. I appreciate you having you on, and we'll definitely check out what the next one holds. But for today, that's all we got. We hope everyone enjoyed. We will, of course, be back next time.